It is so good to see all of you here this evening. We have a number of visitors, and we are so happy that you've come here to be with us in this service tonight. It's been a good day. I have enjoyed this beautiful day. I spent some time today with Brother David, and here I thought he was a truthful man. He said all those nice things about me, and then he said, been preaching over 100 years, I don't believe anything he said about me now. I've probably been preaching longer than some people wish that I preached, and I have had my death announced prematurely. The word got out in Montgomery that I had died. Brother V.P. Black was still living at the time, and one of the board members at Faulkner called Brother Black to see what the arrangements were for my funeral. Well, he said, I just talked to him, I think he's still living. That was about the time that the late Wendell Winkler had died, and I think that word had spread all the way to Wendell's service, because you should have seen the look on some preachers' faces when I walked in. They didn't say what they had heard, but we're all going to face it one day, but perhaps let me finish this sermon first, if you don't mind. There are a lot of things that really are issues that we need to deal with today. And I think one of the greatest things that we need to be dealing with today to make the church strong, not the only thing, but one of them, is to strengthen our families, strengthen our homes. Strong churches are composed of strong families. I don't know any way to say it any plainer, any simpler than that. If you have a congregation that's a strong church, well, then that church is composed of families that are strong, spiritually minded children of God. And to that end, we'll be speaking tonight. English hero Field Marshal Montgomery once said to his troops, "Gentlemen, do not even consider marriage until you have mastered the art of war." There is a war going on today. Since the beginning of time, Satan has fought the family. He entered into the Garden of Eden with the first pair. He entered into that family and caused confusion and chaos and tragedy with their children. And from that day until now, Satan has done everything within his power to destroy the home. You study the book of Genesis and look at all of the instances in the book of Genesis. Starting with chapter 2, going to chapter 4, where we read about polygamy. Chapter 6, where the sons of men saw the daughters, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, they were fair, they made marriages with them. The late Franklin Camp said that those marriages based upon lust and passion were a contributing factor in the eventual destruction of the world in the days of Noah. But even now, Satan is trying to destroy the home. You know, I believe that whatever a family can be is what it ought to be. Matter of fact, whatever anything can be is what it ought to be. If you go buy a new car and you come home with that car like I did in 1967 with a new car, and I found something wrong with it, It wasn't much, but it was a scratch on the hood. Long scratch, deep scratch. I carried it back to the dealer, who happened to be a friend of mine. I pointed it out to him. This is what he said to me. Do you realize, Billy, that if that car was 99, 44, 100% perfect, that it would have 200 things wrong with it? I don't know about you. I don't want to buy a new car 99, 44, 100% perfect that has 200 things wrong with it. You see, whatever it can be is what it ought to be. Whatever a father can be is what he ought to be. Whatever a mother can be is what she ought to be. Whatever a husband can be is what he ought to be. Whatever a wife can be is what she ought to be. I know that we have problems with the home today. Most of it, lots of it, is because of a lack of taking the time on our part. You see, I read about a father who was about to escort his daughter down the aisle on her wedding day. He was a very wealthy man, made a lot of money, and it took a lot of his time away from his family. And they were standing at the rear of the building waiting for that magical moment that he would escort her down the aisle to where the minister was standing. And he looked down into her face, and this is what he said: "We haven't taken much time together, have we?" She said one word: "Nope." It takes time to be a good parent. It takes time to be the right kind of spouse. I like to take more time trying to help people prevent problems, because after the problems come, it's almost impossible sometimes to put them back together. Do you remember the nursery rhyme that you learned about Humpty Dumpty? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all of the king's horses and all of the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Can you imagine how frustrating it would be trying to put a fractured egg back together? That's just about like it is trying to put a fractured marriage back together sometimes. It's nearly impossible sometimes. We need to prevent problems, don't we? I read about a little Indian village that was built down in South America that was built on the edge of a cliff, and the people forever falling down the cliff and injuring themselves, so the town council met to see what they should do. The town council decided they'd build a hospital at the foot of the cliff. Wouldn't it have been better to have moved the village? Wouldn't it have been better to have built a barricade to keep the people from falling? We need to do what we can to prevent things from happening in our marriages and in our homes. I believe that whatever we're trying to do in life, God's way is best. His way is best. It's not second best, it's best. A lot of people today are talking about family values. You hear politicians talk about it. They like to talk about it on the news. We preachers like to talk about it. They write about it in magazines and in books. The thing that I found strange, when people start talking about family values and their viewpoint on it, nobody wants to talk about God's viewpoint about family values. And I would think that if we were concerned about family values, that we'd want to know more what God says about it than anyone else. And there are several reasons I'll give you for that. One reason that I want to know what God said about the home is because God is the creator and the maker of the home. It was in the early morning of time when man was without a companion, and God said it's not good for him to be without a companion. And God gave him a wife. You know, if I have a problem with my lawnmower, I don't take it to a man who works on televisions. That'd be foolish, wouldn't it? If I have a problem with my television, I don't take it down to the Ford Motor Company. They don't know a thing in the world about my car, so how do I know they're going to know anything about the television? I'll tell you that story another time. You would think they'd know all there is to know about it, but I found out They don't. I've got a headlight, been in the shop 7 times, they can't fix it. But you see, if I want to know something about the family, I'm going to take it to the one who made it, and that's God. Another reason that I want to know what God thinks about the family is because He's so much smarter than I am. He's wiser than all of us put together. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, as the heavens are higher than the earth. So are my thoughts and your thoughts, and my ways and your ways. That's found in Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9. Let me tell you a third reason that I tell you we need to know what God says about the home. You're going to answer to God what you do in your home one day. There's not a soul here tonight, but what one day we're going to stand before God, and every one of us will give an account of himself to God. If we have not been what we ought to be in our homes, then we're going to have to answer to God for that. Well, somebody says, what do you mean, Billy, by family value? Well, what is a value? A value is anything you deem to be important. Anything in your life that's important to you is a value, something you value. And the unbelievers of the world determine their values from within themselves. We talked about that in Bible class Sunday morning, if you recall. The unbelievers of the world rely upon what they think. But that's not new nor uncommon. Judges 21:25 says, in those days every man did what was right in his own eyes. That's what the unbelievers, that's how they determine their values. What seems right to them is right to them. What's important to them is important to them, regardless of what you may think. The believers of the world, that is, those who believe in God and believe the Bible, don't determine their own values. Their values have already been determined, haven't they? By the Word of God. You know, Jesus said in Matthew 4:4, man shall not live by what? By bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. That's how we determine our values. We determine them by God. I don't have to wonder whether or not I'm going to worship God on the Lord's Day. That priority is already settled for me. I don't have to determine whether or not I'm going to pray to God on a regular basis. That priority is already settled for me. I don't have to decide whether or not I want to read the Bible. That priority is already settled for me in the Word of God. I don't have to decide whether or not I'm going to tell the truth and be faithful and true to my wife. That priority has already been settled for me in the Word of God. And my values are determined by God's Word. We live in a world of changing values as it relates to the home. You know, we're told today that you can't see things like you once did. Why not? I remember a man telling me that his son spent the night away from home one night. And when he got home, he asked his son, where have you been? And his son said, I spent the night with my girlfriend. And his father was shocked and disappointed. And he began to talk to his son about that and how wrong it was, what he had done was wrong. And the boy said, things are different today. You're living in a different world, Dad. This is a different world today. Things are different today. Well, I ask you, who says so? Who is it that determines things are different today? Is it the government that determines things are different today? Is it somebody in the House of Representatives, somebody in the Senate that determines that? Is it some governor somewhere? Are the teenagers determining what's different today? What's right and wrong today? The Bible is still the Word of God. And God has determined what our values are to be. Somebody said, well, you're just out of step, Billy. Because don't you know, people talk about same-sex marriage. There's no such animal that it even exists. There is no such thing as same-sex marriage, regardless of what people may say. Now, people may have perverted marriage, but that's not how God intended it to be. There's to be one man for one woman, and God determined that it's to be for life. Romans 7, 1 through 4. But we say it's different today. Just suppose the government should change what they consider to be our daily nutritional requirements. I never have really caught on to that. I think my daily nutritional requirements are a little different than what they tell me they ought to be. But suppose they said, we have determined that we don't need to eat as much as we used to. Well, I imagine they'd probably be telling the truth for most of us, But suppose there was a famine in the land. And they said, you don't have to eat as much. You don't need to eat as much. We're trying to save. The fact that they would change the standard would not keep you from getting hungry, would it? You still get hungry. And the fact that somebody says that what God said is out of step with the times does not mean nor set aside what God has said as being the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. When God said, I established the marital relationship, He established it for life. And I believe that God has given us some guidelines that will help us stay together through thick and thin. I call your attention now to the 127th Psalm. And what we learn in the first verse of that psalm is, we're talking about the beginning of a home, that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. I've heard preachers use that passage as it relates to the church, the house of God, but contextually it's talking about a family. In ancient times, there would be a wall built around the cities. And on that wall there would be a watchman. Among his many duties and responsibilities would be to watch for the approach of an enemy. When he saw the enemy coming, he had warned the inhabitants of the city to prepare for battle. I think the lesson, at least to me, is an obvious one. Unless we have the Lord watching our home, in our home, it's going to be almost impossible to keep the devil out of it. I think to end right, you have to start right, don't you? Don't you believe that? If you want to end right, start out right. And if you want to start out with Christ in your home, then you'll end with Christ in your home. I used to give, when people come, young couples say, Brother Lambert, we want to know if you'd perform our ceremony. And I used to give, it was called a premarital inventory. Wasn't a test, I'd explain. This is not a test, you can't flunk it. You can't fail it. But there were 9 parts to that inventory. And one part of it was what they saw is what they'll be doing so far as their religious or spiritual life is concerned. I tell you what I learned in giving that inventory to young couples from the church for a long time. Very few of them ever gave any thought whatsoever to their spiritual life together before they got married. I remember one couple. You see, if you want to end right, you better start out right. Now, there's some people here tonight that are not married right now, some young people. One day you'll be calling up the preacher and say, I want to get married. Let me give you a shopping list of things you ought to take with you on your wedding day. You ought to take with you the loyalty of love on your wedding day. You know, when you get married, you're on cloud nine. But let me tell you what happens to cloud nine sometimes. Cloud nine turns to dark clouds on the horizon of your life. And that which will keep you together through thick and thin is the love you have for each other. Colossians 3:14 says, love is the bond of perfectness. When I think of something's a bond, I think of the super glue. And love is the glue, it's the cement, the adhesive that will keep you together in spite of what happens in your life. Another thing to bring with you on your wedding day is the mind of maturity. You know, the Bible says that a man should leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife. If you're not old enough to leave your father and your mother, you're not old enough to get married. Jack Exum said that the best gift that a mother can give her son on his wedding day are her apron strings. Give him the apron strings. Cut the apron strings. Be mature. Something else you take with you on your wedding day is the tone of trust. Talking about a good woman, a virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. The writer says, who can find a virtuous woman for prices far above rubies? The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, that he shall have no need of spoil. Trust, mutual trust. I was in the state of Missouri in a meeting, and there were several people that responded to the invitation on a Sunday morning, filled up the front pew. Among them was a young woman, and I had seen her before in other meetings that I'd conducted there, so I was familiar with her and knew her. And when she was coming out the door, I was shaking hands, and she said, Brother Lambert, can I talk to you? And I could tell she was visibly shaken. And so the preacher's office was right behind where we were standing, and I asked him if he would allow me to sit in there to talk to her for just a moment. And she said, Brother Lambert, I've had an affair, and my husband found out about it. She said, I've broken it off several months ago, but he still doesn't trust me. If I go to the store, I have to prove I've been to the store. If I go to see my mother, I have to prove I've been to see my mother. She said, some way I'll have to prove to him that I've been to this service. He wasn't there with her that day. She said, what do I do? I don't know what you would have said. It kind of caught me off guard, tell you the truth. Because she had made a confession of sin in her life that morning. Now I understood why. And this is what I said. The only thing I know to tell you is you conduct yourself in such way that that trust that has been lost can be restored. I'd seen it happen before. I knew it could be done. I went back 2 years later. I forgot about that incident. And her husband helped wait on the table that morning. I still didn't think about the 2 years prior to that. But they came out the front door hand in hand. And I just innocently said, how are you all doing? And she grinned a great big grin, and she said, Brother Lambert, things couldn't be better. Then it clicked. And I said, wonderful. That trust is so important. And trust that has been lost can be regained. But bring the tone of trust. Something else to bring with you on your wedding day is the permanence of purpose. How long do you plan to stay married when you get married? Do you find out that his snoring sounds like a freight train? Until you find out she can't cook? Or are you going to stay married until the bills begin to pile up and you don't know what in the world to do and you spend most of your time fussing about money? How long do you plan to stay married? Jesus said, what God had joined together, let not man put asunder. I heard about a place down in Florida that advertised wedding rings for rent. Made you wonder how long they planned to use them. Permanence of purpose. But above all that you do, this is something to bring with you to your wedding day. And it's not too late to have it in your marriage. The stance of spirituality. I can't help but think about Joshua's statement. In Joshua 24:15, you know it. Except for me and my house, he said, we will serve the Lord. We'll serve the Lord. That's the stance of spirituality. But go back to verse 1, Psalms 127. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. You've got to have God in the family, God in the home. When I was still preaching in Mobile during the month of December one year, the elders decided that on Wednesday nights we would invite a different speaker each Wednesday night to preach on the home. And they wanted them to preach the best sermon they had on the home. One of the men we invited was a marriage counselor and a therapist. And we asked if he would talk about what we can do to save our marriages. What can we do? When I called him to give him the invitation at the request of the elders, he said, now, Billy, I'm not a preacher. I said, well, they just want you to talk to us. After he had spoken about a minute and a half to 2 minutes, we understood he was not a preacher. He worked for the state of Alabama in a mental institution, counseling people there, helping people. Later he did this, after he retired, he did this as a profession in counseling and possibly still does it. But he talked that night about the home and problems that he's seen how people have in the home in his career, in his life. And then this is what he said in conclusion. Now I'm going to tell you what the state of Alabama will not allow me to tell people at work. If you want to keep your home together, I'm going to tell you the secret. I'm going to tell you the key to keeping your family together. Well, Jim, I got up on the edge of my seat. I thought, this is going to be the most profound thing I have ever heard in my life. And you know what he said? Listen, if you want to keep your family together, put Jesus first in your life. That's not about it. That's it, brethren. Well, after he talks about the beginning of family, he talks about the birth of children in this family. In Psalms 100, he said, lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hands of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. Do you remember when your children were born? You remember that? Oh, I remember when all three of ours were born. First there was a boy. See, that's back in the day. Some young people here tonight, there's some fathers here tonight who were allowed to go in there with their wives while the child was being born. But when ours were born, you couldn't. We had some kind of disease, I think. They made us sit out in the hall. We couldn't even go in there after they were born. We had to look at them through a window. And I saw that boy. I looked at him. I said, that's mine. He said, don't worry, the pointy head will go away after a while. And it did. And that's been 54 years ago. When I looked in the face of that son, and then a few years later a daughter, A few years later, another daughter. I didn't see those children as just a mind I had to educate or a mouth that I had to feed. I didn't see it just as a body that I had to make sure they had clothes on. I saw them as souls that I had to try to help save, to do everything we could to save their souls. The more I study the Bible, the more I am convinced that the moral, ethical, and spiritual training of children belongs primarily to the home, to the parents. In the Old Testament, Moses put it like this to the Israelites: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy heart, with all of thy soul, with all of thy mind. And the word which I commanded thee this day shall be in thine heart. Thou shalt teach it diligently unto thy children. Thou shalt talk of them when you sit in the house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes and upon the post of your house." Moses said, I want you to teach your children about God. Teach your children to love God. Teach your children to obey the Word of God and read the Bible to them. And you so teach them that the last thing they will remember when they go out the door to get on their own is God and to love God. That belongs to parents. It's not the responsibility of the government to teach our children those things. It's not the responsibility of the public schools or to teach our children those things. It's not even the responsibility of a private Christian school to do that. They may do it, but number one, parents ought to be doing that. I believe in Sunday school with all of my heart. Strong churches have strong educational programs, but the first youth minister that every child should have is his or her daddy. Teach them about God. That's our responsibility. Takes time, doesn't it? Somebody says, well, I try to make time for my children. I want to be just as kind as I can. But I want to be honest with you. You don't find time for anything. You don't find time for your children. You make it. You make the time. And I guess I ought to know, because I stand before you tonight as one who didn't always make that time. I was out teaching someone else's child somewhere, in some gospel meeting somewhere. And my children were up 10, 11, 12 years old before it dawned on me. I need to take more time as a daddy. They did an experiment with some children in cribs. They wired these cribs with mics so they could hear what was said. And they wanted to find out how much time a father spent with those children every day. You know what they learned? That the average father spent 37 seconds a day with those children. On a good day, it takes me longer time than that to sneeze. You have to spend time. Man took off from work one day, took his little boy fishing, went back to work the next day. They said, how was your day yesterday? He said, it was a wasted day. Said, why you say that? Said, well, I had to take my boy fishing. You know what that little boy wrote in his diary that night? Today was the greatest day of my life. My daddy took me fishing. Take time. I'd challenge every young father here tonight. Even if you have teenage children still at home, take the time to be a daddy. Take time to be a mother. Most precious possession that you have, your children. Socrates said over 2,000 years ago, if I could climb to the highest place in Athens, I would lift my voice and proclaim, fellow citizens, why do you turn and scrape every stone to gather wealth and take so little care of your children, to whom one day you must relinquish it all? Our children are precious to us. They are the future. Elders and deacons and Bible class teachers and gospel preachers. We need to make the church strong by having strong families. That begins with each family unit in every congregation. You know, there are a lot of questions in the Bible about children. I think about the question that was asked before Samson was born. What shall I do unto the child, and how shall I order him? There was consideration given to what you ought to do with a child even before the child is born. Of course, if you were to allow some of our people in the world today to answer that, said, well, what we plan to do is kill him. Don't let me get off on that tonight. It gets me too upset to think about what's being done to little precious children today. But it's a sin for us to be silent about it. We need to be speaking about it. Another question that is asked is a young man safe? David asked that about Absalom. The time that David should have been asking about the safety of Absalom was not after Absalom had rebelled against him with a little army and Absalom was dead. It just seems to me the time that he should have been asking about the welfare of Absalom is when David was still the king and Absalom was led of a boy at his knee. Could it be that David was so busy being a king he didn't have time to be a daddy? What a great mistake. What a great mistake. Another question asked about children is in 2 Kings 4. Is it well with the child? Is it well with the child? Is it well with the child with the friends your child has? Is it well with the child with the example that you're setting before those children? I've thought about this a lot over the years. What's the greatest thing that a parent can do for their children? And you may have a different answer, but this is mine. Set a good Christian example before them. Set a good Christian example. Have you ever poured cement for, say, a sidewalk? Maybe you have like one of these out in front of your house. And after that cement, while that cement is still green, somebody goes out there and with a stick or maybe with their finger, they put the date in there. And they put their initials on it. Well, I challenge you after you do that to wait about 24 hours and come back and you try to do that again with your finger or with a stick. You're not going to be able to do it. You know why? You say, well, because the concrete's hardened up. You can't do it after it hardens. And to make impressions on our children, impressions for good. Folks, we got to do it while those children are impressionable. In the days of their youth. Because after a tree is grown, it's hard to, if a tree is leaning in a different direction than it ought to be, it's hard to straighten that tree up. And after a child gets a certain age, it becomes more difficult to change their direction in life if they've not had the right kind of foundation. Doesn't mean it cannot be done, but it becomes more difficult. Example. Our example. Are you setting the kind of an example for your children that will help them, if they follow your example, to go to heaven one day? If they did just exactly what you do, where would it lead them? What kind of a Christian would they be? Well, what example are you setting today before your grandchildren? I know grandparents that are just about as unconcerned about the welfare, the spiritual welfare of their grandchildren as anybody could possibly be. It breaks my heart to see that. I know grandchildren that are crying out for attention from granddaddy, from grandma. They get none. We have responsibility there. God help us to build strong families in this day in which we live. Those children, the psalmist said, are like arrows in our hands. He said, arrows, as arrows are in the hands of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Then he said, happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. Well, Louise and I thought 3 was a quiver full. I had a friend that was an elder at New Hope Church up close to Corinth, and he and Sister Harwell thought, I think 12 was a quiver full, but 3 was a quiver full for us. Whatever you have in your quiver, we have to take those little arrows, like those children that are like arrows, and we need to point them in the right direction in life. I think all of us here tonight believe that. Imagine you have a target. And I've never done much with a bow and an arrow. Maybe some of you hunt with them. But here's a target. And the object is to hit the bullseye, right? That's the object, to hit the bullseye. But if you aim too low, then the arrow's going to fall short. If you aim too high, it's going to go over the target. If you aim too wide, it's going to go around the target or just the edge of the target. But with enough practice and enough time involved, you can get close to hitting the target, the bullseye. I'm not going to tell you that every parent will hit the bullseye every time, because we don't, do we? Sometimes we miss the bullseye. But let us be found trying to hit the target with our children. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Ephesians 6, 3 and 4. Oh, our children, our homes. I like a statement that's made over in the 128th Psalm, and I want to close it with that. In Psalms 128, and I believe it's down verse number 6, and you'll see your children's children and peace upon Israel. You know who he's talking to there? Grandparents. He's talking to grandparents now. You'll see your children's children. He's talking about the twilight years of life. Soon as I get old enough, I'll know what they are, those twilight years of life. I think I'm beginning to see the rays of the sun. But if we build our homes on God, we try to make our homes Christian homes. We try to do everything we can to make our homes a sound, solid, spiritual family unit, and train our children in that way. When we get to the close of life, there's peace in the valley. Peace in the valley. I heard about a husband and wife were down at that point in their lives. They were sitting there before the fireplace. The husband said to the wife, he said, you know, honey, we're getting on up in years. He said, yes, we are. Or she said, yes, we are. He said to her, you know, honey, it's not going to be long till there'll only be one of us left. She said, yes, I know. And when that happens, I plan to move to Florida. We need to live so that when we come to that point in our lives, there's peace and contentment. Peace in our hearts. But you got to make your home a Christian home. There may be someone here tonight that's not a Christian. There may be someone here tonight who's not living in that home like a Christian. And I want to appeal to your heart tonight. I've just talked to you out of my heart to you tonight. I was in Phoenix City, Alabama, in a gospel meeting many years ago. There was a couple that was attending that meeting. They attended about 2 services. And it just appeared to me that they were visiting, and it turned out that was the case. He was the son of one of the members of a couple there, and he and his family were visiting. And I told the preacher, I said, well, I asked him, I said, are they Christians? He said, oh no, they're not Christians. I said, let's go see them. Actually, one night after the service, we went over to their home and surprised them. And we went in and we sat down, and I said, we're glad that you came to the service tonight. Well, he said, I enjoyed it. I said, have any questions? No. I said, I want to encourage you to come back tomorrow night. He says, well, I won't be. This was on a Sunday night, incidentally. And he said, I won't be there. I said, why not? He said, because I stay home and I watch football on Monday night football. I said, well, what time does it come on? And he told me what time. I said, do you know, if you will come, you come, and I promise I'll quit on time, you won't miss but just a few minutes of that football game. I promise you, I'll quit on time. He said, well, I'll see. I said, you ever thought about becoming a Christian, Jimmy? He said, now listen, don't talk to me about that. I like to hunt, I like to fish, and I do them on Sunday. I said, I like to hunt and I love to fish. In that order. But I said, I don't intend to let a rack of deer horns or a fish cost me my soul. I said, you have a beautiful family. You have a wonderful wife. You have some beautiful children here. They were all sitting right there. I said, have you ever thought about this, Jimmy? There's not a one of those children that asked you to be their daddy. And there are a lot of things they don't have a right to. I don't believe there's a child on the face of this earth that has a right to that so-called silver spoon in their mouth. But I tell you what they do have a right to. They have a right to a Christian daddy. And they have a right to a Christian mama. Do you know what to do to be saved? Yes. You know what I asked her, did she? Yes, I know. I said, I want to plead with you to give your life to Christ. 2 days later, they did. He eventually became an elder in the church. I've lost track of him since then. He may not even be alive now. But let me ask you, what about your home? Are you satisfied? Why don't you leave? If you're not, why don't you do something so you can leave satisfied? Come while we stand, while we sing.